The Purification of the Mind, Cantos 11 to 19. At this point, Dante begins the journey through the 7 levels of purgatory, where the souls undergo a punishment created by the law of contrapasso. It is not a Dantean invention. Etymologically, the word derives from contra pati, that is, suffer the opposite. In general, when contrapasso is mentioned, one thinks of hell, but looking closer, there the pains are not the opposite of the sin, but rather they represent it and reveal its essence. One thinks, for example, of the infernal storm. It is an exact depiction of being dragged along. In purgatory instead, the penalties are configured in such a way to render the sin impossible. The proud, for example, walk along carrying heavy boulders that constrain them to a bent-over position, contrary to the posture of pride. Here, different to hell, Dante doesn't limit himself to being a wayfarer who tells us what he sees, but for the sins of which he recognizes himself guilty, pride and anger, he too submits himself to the penalties. He submits, he purifies himself, he ascends to the heavens. But he is alive, and looking closer, the penalties are not presented as a punishment to pay a debt, but rather a way of purifying the mind, something that makes sense only for someone who is alive. We don't know how the training took place of whoever aspired to the consolamentum, but given the precise findings that we have already found and are yet to find between the Cathar path and the Dantean, we can presume that such training hinged on the control of the mind, as Dante teaches. It is only this way, moreover, that the irreproachable life that they led, praised by all, even by their enemies, can be explained. In fact, as the Indian masters say, it is impossible to control the senses if the mind is not controlled first. Attempting to control the senses before the mind is under control is like trying to remove water from a ship that has a leak without first sealing the leak. In hell, Dante meets sinners who have all committed some sin, and this is the moral aspect. But to the ends of the anagogical spiritual imperative, the sin matters little. What counts is a much more dangerous thing, the disposition of character, of the mind that has made the sin possible. We think, for example, of the icy lake in which the traitors are set. They have betrayed, it's true, it is their sin, but more important is that frozen lake, the ice that surrounds them, that isolates them one from the other, and that represents the mental disposition that made betrayal possible. The mental disposition, until it is purified, continues to make any sin possible. Dante's purgatory has exactly this function, to purify the mind. The first example that shows that it deals precisely with the control of the mind concerns pride, the sin atoned for on the first level. Dante also submits himself. He does it in a literal sense, to be able to speak to the souls of the proud, constrained to walk under the weight of heavy boulders. He does it in a moral sense, to atone for this sin of which he feels guilty. He does it, in an anagogical sense, to acquire control of his own mind, of his own thoughts. Here is what he says, page 198. As oxen, yoked, proceed abreast, so I moved with that burdened soul as long as my kind pedagogue allowed me to. But when he said, leave him behind and go ahead, for here is fitting that with wings and oars each urge his boat along with all his force, I drew my body up again, erect, the stance most suitable to man, and yet the thoughts I thought were still submissive, bent. Purgatory 12, 1-9. Still more significant is the long discourse on one of the fundamental themes, free will, that unfolds over the 3 central cantos of the poem. Starting the conversation is that Marco Lombardo, who we have already spoken about, And then Virgil takes it up again in one of the most important doctrinal passages in all of the poem. I will try to summarize it. Dante asks Marco to explain to him where evil is born. The answer is simple. From you men. Certainly not from the stars. And how? How is evil born? Marco explains it. The simple soul that knows nothing, that is, the soul of the newborn baby, desires only to return to what gives it joy, that is, to God, because it comes from there and that is all it knows. This is one of the most important ideas, reaffirmed many times, and not only in the comedy. The nature, the instinct of the human soul is to return to God because it knows God gives it pleasure. But what happens? Of trivial good at first it tastes the savour, is cheated by it, and runs after it. Purgatory 16, 91-92. That is, the soul is deceived because all that pleases it, even just a little pleasure, believes that God is behind it and runs after it, in other words, desires it. From this desire, born of deception, a fundamental concept, evil is born. Page 199. Marco's discourse then takes a political turn, very importantly and decidedly heretical, which, however, is beyond the scope of this theme. Then Virgil completes the discourse and explains how desire is born, that is to say, how this deception is born. The terms are those, somewhat difficult, of scholastic philosophy, but it will be enough to substitute them with the terms we use today, and everything becomes clear. Your apprehension draws an image from a real object and expands upon that object until the soul has turned towards it, and if, so turned, the soul tends steadfastly, then that propensity is love. Then, so does the soul, when seized, move into desire, a motion of the spirit, never resting till the beloved thing has made it joyous. Purgatory 18, 22-33. I think the discourse becomes easy when reading the paraphrasing. Of every real object, an animal, a car, a house, the human being creates an image. Intention is a term in scholastic philosophy that means image, that is obviously mental. The following verses refer to this mental image and not to the object. It's unequivocal because Dante uses the feminine. Intenzione is feminine, while esser verace is masculine. We reread the verses. Expands upon that object until the soul turns towards it, tends it. One falls in love not with an object, but of a mental image that we have made of it. No commentary emphasizes this. Chiavacci affirms, for example, that here is described the cognitive process according to Aristotelian and scholastic philosophy, by which man knows by abstracting from the world of the senses, an act that is preliminary to love, in that man loves only that which he knows. From knowledge, now love is born. Love that would be aroused by a pleasing object. That is not what Dante says here. It's not about knowing. On the contrary, desire is born from not knowing. Page 200. In the following canto, Dante gives an example of this discourse that none of the critics present as such. However, it's not a case of giving an example. We are also given the solution to the problem. It is the famous dream of the stuttering woman. After a long astronomical explanation to indicate that it is 4 a.m, he says, "A stammering woman came to me in dream, her eyes askew and crooked on her feet. Her hands were crippled, her complexion sallow. I looked at her, and just as sun revives cold limbs that night made numb, so did my gaze loosen her tongue, and then in little time set her contorted limbs in perfect order. And with the colouring that love prefers, my eyes transformed the wanness of her features." Purgatory 19, 7 to 15. It seems clear to me because it is an example of the previous topic. The real object, the real thing, is an ugly woman, indeed hideous, not a pleasing object. She becomes beautiful? No, ugly she was and ugly she remains. Where did she become beautiful and desirable? Only in the mental image. In fact, Dante can't take his eyes off her. At this point, a holy lady intervenes who says, "Oh, Virgil, Virgil, who is this?" Then Virgil, who represents reason, moves towards the stuttering woman, strips off her clothes, and shows to me her stomach that waked me with the stench that issued from it. This is knowledge. Dante returns to see things as they really are. He has destroyed the false mental image. It is, therefore, a purification of the mind that Dante accomplishes in his purgatory. This also is part of the path of knowledge of himself, to know the contents of his own mind for what it is, not for what he would like it to be. Dante is of extraordinary modernity and of an equally extraordinary beauty. If I have insisted on this point, it is because I believe it to be truly one of the fundamental keys to understanding Dante's thinking, too often misrepresented.